Welcome to the Chess Channel, the channel where you can learn loads. We have covered a variety of videos through time, and each one of them offers invaluable insights into the game. Last time, we saw how one of the biggest names in the history of the game lose to an amateur. If you missed it and would like to see it, we have added this link that is now appearing on the top right of your screen. Have a sneak peek at it because it offers plenty of valuable points. What are the chances Mikhail Tal would lose a simultaneous game to an unknown player? Simultaneous exhibitions are meant to be for two main reasons. The Grandmaster or Master will normally showcase their strengths and abilities against normal people who would not otherwise get the chance to play against the likes of Grandmasters. Sims therefore work into two or more ways. The normal club player finally gets the chance to play against a much stronger rival, and for them, it can be a one-off type of experience. The likelihood of anyone taking part in a simultaneous against a Grandmaster and wins is minimal, but it is the experience that mostly counts. Every Super Grandmaster has organized simultaneous events, and there are so many of them about involving basically every single Grandmaster from the old to recent times. The undisputed reigning champion Magnus Carlsen too had his fair share of getting involved into simultaneous exhibitions, and those who were fortunate enough to play against him took away with them the experience, the excitement, and of course the ability to play against someone who would not get the chance to otherwise play, the likes of Magnus. Magnus Carlsen needs no introduction and has basically beaten anyone who steps in his way. Magnus also astounded the entire chess community by his ability to play chess blindly. In 2015, he took on in Vienna 5 different players using variable time controls. In 2016 he went to the United States of America and participated in a handicap simultaneous. Carlsen had only 30 minutes for all of his games, and each of his rival had a full half an hour for their game. In the same year, Carlsen also took part in another simultaneous, and this was in Hamburg, Germany. This is the tournament where we're going to stop at. The event took part in February, and the setup was that Carlsen would play 70 simultaneous games in one go. The event was physically exhausting and took a whopping 6 hours. If you have never heard of this event, well, let's put it mildly. Carlsen at half-time ended up with this score, and one by one, his opponents, who involved different types of people, were falling one by one. The event was extremely popular, and this is one of many pictures to see how many were willing to queue up at He Harbour area where the venue was held. This is an hour before the venue was to start. Soon after, the hall was set up. Those who qualified were beginning to gather around the chessboards, and once everyone took their seat, when everyone was instructed, Magnus walks in and starts with the white pieces. Now that we have seen a few pictures from the actual event, we can look at one board in particular. It was Carlsen's game against Mr. Jens-Erik Rudolph, a keen chess player who we will say something later on. Carlsen White kicked things off with the English. Erik Rudolph responded with this move, and with knight c3, this is how Erik replies. Bishops on g7 are always worrisome and signify a King's Indian type of approach. With Magnus here taking the initiative for the center, Erik preps this move, and with e4 appearing, Erik too goes for the center via this approach. Not wanting to open up the board, Magnus pushed on. Jens-Erik replies in this way, and with Carlsen trying this approach to the game, Jens-Erik develops the queenside knight to the rim of the board. This move aims to get the knight to sneak into b4 to chase after the bishop on d3. Magnus chose for this avenue of play with the main aim to get his king to safety. Knight f6, the move Jens-Erik chose to play, led Magnus to immediately apply this pin, but with Jens-Erik instantly challenging this bishop, Carlsen could either trade or back off. With Magnus choosing to back off in this way, Jens-Erik could have mounted the pressure on this bishop, but in the end, he went and got his king to safety. f3 by Magnus, supporting and reinforcing his dominance in the center, led Jens-Erik to launch after the bishop. Magnus had no intention of swapping the bishop for the knight, and with him backing him off to the second, Jens-Erik develops his bishop to this outpost. This move keeps check on the light squares west of the board, but is this going to stop Magnus from getting his knight into b5? At some stage Magnus can challenge this bishop on d7, but for the time being, he has other plans. Firstly, he got his king to safety. Jens-Erik solidifies his control west of the board and with regards to the light squares by getting this queen move in, and out of nowhere Magnus appears to be out of moves. Though this bishop on h4 can be repositioned, Magnus tries something else which is way more eccentric. Does anyone want to try and guess this move? This was that move. What prompted the world champion to go for something like this, and what potential response did he see coming? As soon as Jens-Erik opted for this knight retreat to the 7th, his plan was getting clearer. Jens-Erik is aiming to open up the f-file, which is indicative of how the King's Indian is played. By the way, for those who are not familiar with this type of opening, what we experienced is the modern variation using the Averbach. Let us see how the game continued. Carlsen was looking at a line where possibly Jens-Erik could use. With the queen and bishop parked on e8 and d7 respectively, and with the knight in control of a4, Carlsen decided in the end to hinder the access to the queenside. In light of this, he went for this move, but for a player like Rudolph, who was in fact a rookie, if we try and evaluate his position, he is in fact quite fine. The main idea is to find a way to break through on queenside, and at the same time, he has the kingside which he can exploit. Jens-Erik in the end went for it. He thrusted along with this move, and Carlsen was somehow beginning to feel some pressure. He knew a player who has not yet reached the 2000 mark rating was probably not going to last long. Having said this, Carlsen was considering whether to have this pawn removed or opt for some other move. In the end, this is what he does, and in fact allows Rudolph to take some control or some initiative on the kingside. And yet, Rudolph himself ignores this position too. Though he could have launched after the bishop f2 and this push right into f4, and Rudolph would have an excellent position on the board. It's by no means winning, but with such a close situation with all the pawns blocking everything, this at least could look like a very viable draw. We saw nothing like this unfold. Rudolph decided in the end to go for this push on the queenside and was probably expecting Magnus to come in with this move to b4. Rudolph had been right all along. With Magnus going for it, Rudolph had it all sussed out. He still kept the position close and opted for this move. Queen d2 by Magnus was a particularly difficult move to understand, but Rudolph was not going to allow any unexpected surprises or developments. He closed the gap in this way, allowing basically Magnus to finally back off his bishop from a square he had basically very little to do. With the bishop backing off, Rudolph finally gets to advance this pawn, and with him now having opened his kingside, was this a worrying position to have against a player like Magnus? All these pawns in the center from both sides do slow down the game, and unless the board opens up, it would be extremely difficult to break open this game. Magnus wanted to create at least some chances, and after careful consideration, he chose to jump the knight into this outpost. This move threatens the pawn on c7, but with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different ways to cover, Rudolph was expecting to use at least. And he does. He decided to swap the bishop to the knight and lands Carlsen with a double pawn. h5 by Jens-Erik resulted to this knight jump. What is the knight doing here, and why did Magnus go for this specific response? And here is where the game is about to explode. Jens-Erik decided to make things happen, and this is how he starts the journey. He pushed along with yet another pawn and is now making the world champion's position very sketchy. Queen e2, to be able to deal with any eventualities, led to this queen repositioning by Rudolph, and even if Rudolph was going to lose in the end, he was at least having a great game going on. We know how this game ends, but no one knew what to expect. Not Rudolph, not Carlsen, or anyone else watching this game. Rook c1 finally led to Rudolph to get his kingside knight to occupy a more interesting outpost, and by placing him on a square where the knight usually belongs, Carlsen is full aware what Rudolph is cooking. Bishop d1 resulted to the bishop to find a more appropriate outpost, and this game had now become a top-notch game. 24 moves have been played so far, and if anything, the world champion is being knocked about by an amateur who is nowhere near any remarkable rating. Bishop to the first to avoid any unpleasant surprise, got Rudolph to lift the rook to the 7th, and anyone who was watching this game knew what this move meant. Rook a2, which is fully defensive in nature to stop the infiltration on the 2nd, led to this brand new development, and Carlsen was now feeling the heat, which was generated by a player who had just about half of his own rating. How was this at all possible? Rook c2 was played here with the aim to find a way to scoop up this pawn on c7. Even though Rudolph was playing the game of his life, he was not going to take any unnecessary leaps. In the end, he chose to walk the king to the very edge of the board and allows Carlsen to decide on how he wants to continue. Carlsen's response: it was this queen move to the very first. Carlsen knew how dangerous this position was, and he was not going to expose his king to any unwanted surprises. When Rudolph got his last rook to join in the fun, the alarm bells were sounding in the background. Can he make the big bang, and does Magnus have his pieces in places where he can prevent disaster? If you look at this position, it takes what it takes to be able to defend, but when was it last time you saw Carlsen having trouble? What you see here is also rare, to say the least. Magnus has all his pieces stuck on the first, with the exception of the rook and a minor piece on the third. What you also don't see often are all the pawns being intact. This is move 28 out of the way, and you can imagine, by now Carlsen had beaten most of his opponents. Did it ever occur to the world champ, this game could go south? And south it went. In the end, bishop h4 with the aim to exchange him for the knight, led to this new development, and Magnus at this stage was very skeptical. Should the bishops be traded? Knight a4, for example, is going to lead to repercussions. Knight e8, take, and something like this rook move will simply not be strong enough. Rook h7, and you can feel the pressure Magnus is under. Not only this knight on a4 is out of play, but it would be Magnus who is most likely to be out of moves. Rook c2, for example, and now knight b7 to get this knight going too, can easily lead to another consecutive knight move. Should Rudolph do the same and slot his queenside knight into this outpost, Carlsen will severely be restricted. If he challenges this knight in this way, you can either trade, or even slightly better, appears to be this queen sneaking into the rim of the board. If you go for this option, even if the knight does come off, provided you know who you would like to capture, Rudolph would have a field day. There is a substantial difference in how the game would continue if you capture this pawn wrongly. For example, and this is just to illustrate, capturing with this pawn from b6 is going to pretty much level the score. By allowing this push to a4, this passed pawn is now a worry. Knight f6 to free up the back rank will now be followed by yet another pawn push on the queenside, and with both these rooks on c2 and c3 respectively, Rudolph will have a problem to keep them in check. Returning to this specific point in time, if the knight is captured using this pawn, if you now advance this pawn, this spot on d6 can now be fully utilized. If you get the knight to occupy it, even if you call in this rook, do expect to see this rook repositioning, and before you know, the pressure on g2 is quite noticeable. a5 here would not be possible because this pawn on b5 is going to drop, and Magnus will dig himself a deeper hole. If you go rook c2, Rudolph's best shot could be this knight jump into b7. We can analyze this position a bit more, but however you choose to put it, Magnus would be playing catch-up, to say the least. If we return to the actual game, this was the position we looked at. When Carlsen returned his bishop into the second, he was unwilling to trade, and at the same time, he did not want to risk him getting trapped. But as things stood, there was not much choice. With Jens-Erik chasing after this bishop in this way, if you ever consider of getting rid of this pawn, all hell breaks loose. Not only this pawn will be captured automatically, but with the bishop and rook coming under instant fire, something would need to give. If you take, and you need to, this rook would also vanish, and because this bishop on g3 is fully exposed, this bishop on c1 cannot be taken. If you do capture this bishop on g3 would also go, and that would be it. Coming back to the actual game, Carlsen had zero choice. He returned the bishop to the first, and Rudolph was trying to calculate what was best to play. Do you remove this pawn from h2, or do you fish out some other move? In the end, this pawn was removed. Magnus in turn jumps the knight to the rim of the board, and the main reason for this response was to try and create a situation on the 7th. Rudolph can cover in a variety of ways. He decided to do this using his knight. Carlsen in turn returns the knight back to the second, and is now looking at rerouting into d3, and from there he can look at either getting this knight to squat into f2 or go for some other initiative. In either situation, Carlsen is fully aware that his position is not sustainable, and if he does not put in all his might, Rudolph will walk all over him. Rudolph must have felt very confident. If only he was able to beat the world's very best. He first took this pawn, and as soon as Magnus captured, what follows is just epic. This pawn on the king side made his way into the fourth. Magnus, just like we predicted, jumped the knight into the third, and next this knight must be wanting to find this outpost on f2. Carlsen needs to find a way to get to this bishop that is parked on g5, and the only way to do this will have to be to reposition the knight into f2 and then jump him into h3. A player like Rudolph, who is way below any respectable rating, saw exactly what was coming, and before going for anything else, believe it or not, picks up his bishop and pulls him back all the way to the last. And because this bishop move departed, though Carlsen could still get the knight to come into f2, he bypasses this move to something else. That something else was to remove this pawn from h2. It looks like such a risky move to go for, but with Magnus being able to calculate this pawn on g2 is covered by the king, the rook and the queen, he also knew Rudolph was very unlikely able to find a way to get to the king. In addition, this outpost on g3 is inaccessible, and even if it was, Carlsen can always get his king to retreat to a more safe square. Taking the reigning world champion into a 35-move journey and achieving such a position on the board, all eyes in this demonstrative event in Hamburg were now focusing on this one game alone. Needless to say, at this stage, Jens-Erik Rudolph, win or lose, was having the time of his life. Not only he had the opportunity to play against the likes of Magnus Carlsen, but who would ever imagine he would at the same time give him a good run for his money. Rudolph here is looking for a way to get his knight on e8 to become more active, but because knight f6 is most likely to drop this pawn from h4, he actually bypasses. Even if you do go for this knight move, should Magnus capture this pawn, Magnus would be the one who is going to pay the price. How? It's here with this move. This rook response is good enough to pick up this bishop. Why can't Carlsen cover in this way? If he does, can you work out one possible continuation? It's here. Just pick up this pawn, and when the knight is captured, not only the chessboard breaks wide open, but with this two-pronged attack on two minor pieces, Magnus would be a sitting duck. First, there is this knight on d3 that is going to perish, and second, there is this bishop on h4 that go. What do you pick up first and why? The correct way to do this would be to grab hold of the bishop. Not only the queen is now coming under fire, but as soon as this bishop moves away, there is a lovely discovery on the way. Queen e2 would be the biggest mistake in the game because Rudolph would secure a checkmate. It is easily spottable because everything ends in just one move. This is the only move you are looking for, and it would be game over. Coming back to the actual game, Rudolph is looking for knight f6, but first he got this rook move going. Magnus in turn jumps the knight into the second. And with Rudolph now getting the knight to jump into the action, Carlsen opts for a consecutive knight jump. Knight h5 led to Carlsen to start breathing. He used this rook to take control of the open file. Rudolph in turn launches after the queen using the knight. And as soon as Carlsen moved the queen out of any danger, this is how Rudolph plays it. It appears any advantage Rudolph could have had is now eroded. With Magnus now being able to free up his pieces, slowly and gradually, this is exactly what he wanted. Carlsen, without any real delay, used the rook to attack the knight. Rudolph backs off the knight to the back rank. And this is what happened next. The pawn on c7 was removed. Both rooks on c7 also disappeared. And again, what happened next is what made Carlsen itchy. Can you see what Rudolph played? It was this knight jump right into the center of the board. If you ignore this knight jump, you will get checkmated in one single move. Carlsen can back off his queen to stop the mate, or he can call back his rook to do the same. With Carlsen choosing to bring the rook back, Rudolph brings the knight right into this outpost on e3, and this is how Carlsen knew he had messed things up big time. This knight on e3 in such a position is the knight from hell no rival wants to have. It's not just the direct attack on the rook, but this knight is so well positioned, he is the mother of all headache. Rook a2, getting him out of trouble. And this is where Rudolph launches another vicious attack. Can you see what he does and how he made the reigning champion Magnus Carlsen jump? This was the move he went for. Queen e2 to prevent disaster, led to the knight to return to where he was earlier. Carlsen is very close from getting checkmated, but with his unbelievable ability to perform accurate calculations, he knew the knight was able to prevent any immediate checkmates. What he did here was to activate this bishop just to be able to get him out of the knight's reach. Knight f7 led to Carlsen to reposition his queen here. But what is the aim of this response? Only Carlsen knows what this move does, but maybe a biggest question to ask is how Rudolph needed to play and whether he found the only move in the game that really mattered. Can you spot what he did and why this move was the big determinant? If you are in need of a hint, this knight on d3 is key. This was the move Rudolph executed, and this had to be it. With the queen's evacuation from this file, there is nothing stopping the incoming rook g2 to pick up the queen. When Magnus saw this move appear, he knew it was game over, but with his overall success in Hamburg over all other 69 boards, could he afford to at least lose one? As soon as Magnus opted for this queen repositioning, Rudolph's eyes lit up. He came in with this check. Magnus picks up the rook, and as soon as the queen went, there would be a big difference in how you choose to continue. If you pick up the knight using the rook, this pawn will vanish, and with the bishop on b3 being in danger, this game would not last long. For this reason, Magnus got rid of the knight using the king. Rudolph immediately after jumps c-knight to challenge the knight on h3, but with Carlsen pulling back, Magnus knew he was going down, but he wanted to go down in style. One big move Rudolph oversaw and nearly cost him the game was how he played it next. Can you see what he missed and how he could have finished off the world's best? It's this move here. If you take the pawn, even if you lose the knight, this incoming check is all you would ever need. King f2 falls short to this move and Carlsen would pay for it. At best, there is this check, but as soon as the king finds the 7th, another check will not cut it. King g6. And from this position you can be looking at a checkmate. Coming back to the game, Rudolph tried this in a rather incorrect order. He first came in with a check. Magnus squeezes his king into the corner of the board, and because there is complication where Rudolph can drop his queen, this is what he does first. This is a first-class response from a player of this caliber. Rook h2 by Magnus resulted to the instant elimination of this pawn. And with the taking of this knight, this is how Rudolph tries to settle the score. Can you see what he did? He got rid of this pawn and is very confident even Magnus would not be able to keep up. Magnus here went on to get rid of this pawn. The king found the 7th, and with now the king finding his way into this outpost, this incoming check was the icing on the cake. And this was the point of no return for Magnus, who resigned and gives Rudolph the biggest satisfaction in his life, which was also well worth it. Rudolph is the only person in this simultaneous to have beaten the world champion, and we bet many people have not been aware of this great victory by someone who had not reached even a 2000 rating. Rudolph from this point on had become a national hero and his name was splashed across the newspapers all across Germany. We said very little about our unknown winner, who was the only one who came on top with a win over Carlsen. Jens-Erik Rudolph is an avid old chess classical writer who actually brings to life old chess books. Other than that, very little is known about Rudolph, and what is rather strange about this encounter in Hamburg, there is very little footage about the entire event. It was as if the use of cameras was banned and filming crews had stayed away from this given venue. This might be one reason why Rudolph's victory over Magnus Carlsen has been kept more as a secret, but rest assured, if you are going to search to find a YouTube coverage, this channel is the only one to date to feature it. At the end of the game, Jens-Erik leaves this unforgettable event after Magnus has signed this paper which Jens-Erik now guards with his life. This is probably the most important piece of paper that anyone would wish to have, showing clearly the game move by move and the end result. And this was our material for today. Jens-Erik Rudolph has been the only one to make a big bang against the reigning chess champion Magnus Carlsen, not just playing the game of his life but making a relatively easy meal out of Magnus himself. However, before we finish off today, we also need to be fair. Given Magnus had 30 minutes to play all of his games and given each player had 30 minutes to play an entire game, was this really a fair contested game? Whether it was or not, the end result does not change. Magnus Carlsen, who rarely loses to anyone, loses his only game to an Untitled player, and what a better moment for Jens-Erik Rudolph, who had the experience of his life. We sincerely hope to bring you more stuff, and until that time comes, God bless and stay safe.